you online. Especially happy to have in-person people. Today we have our own Maddie Duhon. Maddie just finished her PhD in economics, Berkeley economics, and comes with a background in development. And now she's kind of transitioning, adding new skills and interests related to demography in her postdoc here, where she's working on aging in Africa, among other topics. But today she's going to be presenting from her dissertation work. Am I right? Okay. And Maddie will tell us a little bit what the status of this is and what she wants to hear from us. So she gets to set the guidelines for how the talk goes, except that we are ending her talk at about 10 minutes, 5 minutes before the hour, and start discussion, depending on how much interruption questions we have going. Do you want people to interrupt as we go, or?
Definitely, yeah, very open to interruptions throughout, especially if something I say is unclear or confusing.
Okay, but if we disagree, we don't have to wait till the end. We can just jump in.
Right, jump
Okay.
Especially if you disagree.
Okay. So with that, take it away, Maddie.
All right. Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. It's great to see faces from Econ and KLPS and SIGA, and also co-authors. I really appreciate it. Hope that this isn't a below average talk. That'll make more sense as we go. So as Josh mentioned, this is my dissertation work. So the status is kind of come together into a sort of a cohesive, kind of shorter working paper, and very open to all feedback throughout the talk. So please feel free to jump in. So I'm presenting on how socioeconomic status shapes parental beliefs about child academic achievement. So how their children perform academically. And I'm drawing on novel evidence from 3 different contexts: India, Kenya, and the USA. Don't want to automatically resize. Okay, so some motivation for this research is that parental beliefs about child academic performance can influence educational investments and, of course, eventual outcomes through both direct and indirect channel. So depending on how you think your child is doing academically, that might influence what you think the cost of effort in schooling will be, what the returns to schooling will be, could also influence your expectations or the way that you motivate your child or things like that. Now, parental beliefs may not actually accurately or precisely reflect academic performance, and there's some existing research on that shows that that is the case. If there are disparities in parental beliefs, whether they're overestimates or underestimates of actual performance, and these disparities go along socioeconomic lines, that could contribute to the persistence of kind of disparities in educational investments and eventual outcomes along socioeconomic lines. Similarly, and this is a more minor part, so I won't talk quite as much about that, but disparities in subject-specific beliefs, so ability or performance in math versus reading, by child gender, could also contribute to gaps in participation in things like math or STEM-related fields. So just a quick note on terminology before I go forward. When I say parental beliefs about child academic achievement, what I'm thinking of is how parents perceive their child is doing academically. So do they think their child is above average, average, or below average? Secondly, when I talk about socioeconomic status or socioeconomic advantage or disadvantage, there's a couple of different dimensions that I have in mind. Economic circumstances, which is the one that I focus primarily on, but a lot of the patterns that I'm going to talk about go through with respect to parental education, and then also with respect to different identities such as caste in India or racial group in the USA. So I focus on economic circumstances and I talk about socioeconomic status, kind of incorporating these different dimensions.
I have one question. So we're talking about parental beliefs for the child, but parental beliefs could also influence, say, like the teacher.
Yes.
Will you sort of hold that constant, or like how should we think about sort of the supply side of this?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I actually don't have any data on teachers themselves, and I don't, that's not something I take into consideration here. There is some work that looks at actually the reverse, and that's in the US that shows that, you know, the flow of information from teachers to parents can bias parents. I don't have the data on the teacher side to do anything like that, but I do think that would be interesting. Yeah.
Are you gonna have the grades that the teachers give?
I have test scores, not from teachers, but from, you know, a test that's administered concurrently with the survey where beliefs are elicited. So maybe even better than the test scores, a slightly different concept than like term grades or something like that. Okay, I do have, so Tara, to your question, I do have sort of a very secondary finding is that like how parents perceive the information they receive from schools. So it's self-reported, but I do have data on that, and that does not differ along socioeconomic lines. Okay, so with that motivation in mind, I have 3 primary research questions, which are, do parental beliefs about child academic performance differ by socioeconomic status? If so, does socioeconomic status causally shape beliefs? And then through which channels could socioeconomic status shape beliefs? Some sort of secondary questions are whether there are math or reading specific disparities by child gender, and then how any existing socioeconomic or gender-based disparities impact subsequent investments. So a quick note on related research, which I think is useful to comment on because there is quite a lot of work in related spaces. So I relate to 4 different strands of the literature. The first and most closely related is that looks at the impact of parental beliefs on educational investments. So there's a great body of research that looks at how information frictions impact the beliefs that parents hold about how their kids are doing. That also demonstrates that in response to clear or new information, digestible information, report cards, things like that, beliefs update. And then finally shows that there is a causal link between parental beliefs and investments. The second strand of the literature just documents, there's an extensive body of work documenting socioeconomic disparities in actual educational investments. So there's disparities in beliefs about how investments translate into outcomes, so to speak, the shape of the production function. The importance of early versus late investments, there's disparities in that along socioeconomic lines, what educational opportunities even exist, the returns to education, et cetera, et cetera.
I have one question about that literature. So for like SES, I sort of could imagine the absolute amount of the investment differing just sort of very mechanically. But when you look at sort of like percent of say like household budget that's going to like education, how does that vary by socioeconomic status?
So you mean if the question is like, if you dedicate 10% of your household income, how does that? Yeah, I don't know. I think it's more to do with absolute amounts in this literature. But I could dig more into that and get back to you. Okay, the third strand of the literature, I won't talk too much about this again, but is documenting gender-based disparities in math and STEM participation. So there's some work that shows that females throughout kind of all ages participate less in math and STEM fields, and in some contexts perform worse. Kind of related strand of the research argues and demonstrates that this doesn't stem from differences in ability in math, but rather from cultural and gender norms, differences in competence and the influence of stereotypes and things like that. And then finally, the fourth related literature shows how socioeconomic status, material well-being, even poverty influences related constructs such as aspiration, self-efficacy, higher rates of depression and hopelessness, these things that maybe aren't directly related to beliefs, but we might think they kind of correlate or they all kind of lean in the same direction.
Is there a literature on the kind of cognitive bias that you're going to discover? And there was a reason for it, why that cognitive bias might be adaptive, or is your finding so new that no one has even looked into why it might exist?
Yeah, so great question. So I think overconfidence and underconfidence in general, there is. So there's a literature looking at how, overconfidence can be sort of an adaptive or a productive mindset. Because I don't really pin down what the mechanism is, I don't know whether, I actually don't have a way of concluding this comes from exactly XYZ, right? I discuss at the end some different mechanisms that could be leading to this pattern, the pattern that I'm going to show you. But I'm not able to explain exactly what that mechanism is. And so, but yes, all of the kind of candidate mechanisms that might be out there, I think there are literature speaking to those. And it may be useful to pull those in. Okay, so kind of summing up this related research. So the existing research documents gaps in educational investments by socioeconomic status, shows that beliefs matter, they influence educational investments, looks at disparities by socioeconomic for kind of related but very distinct forms of beliefs, and looks at disparities by socioeconomic status in other kind of related psychological constructs. This literature doesn't have that much work looking at disparities in parental beliefs about child achievement specifically by socioeconomic status. So that's kind of where this work fits within, but is a little bit new. Okay, so this paper does five things. I'll spend the most time on the first and second today. So I document disparities in parental beliefs along socioeconomic lines. So when I say these disparities, what I mean is that more socioeconomically advantaged parents are much more likely to believe their children are above average compared to equally performing children from socioeconomically disadvantaged families, and vice versa for belief below average. I show evidence to support a causal link between one of these dimensions of socioeconomic status, that being household economic circumstances and parental beliefs. And I do that by showing that below average beliefs become more likely among rural households that experience adverse rainfall shock that reduces their agricultural income. And then I show that above average beliefs are more likely among recipients of a randomized early life health intervention with lasting positive impacts. That may sound very familiar to some in the room. A third thing I do is I document disparities in subject-specific beliefs by gender. And so what I mean by that is that in the US, and this is a pattern that only kind of appears in the US, parents are more likely to believe males are above average in math and that females are above average in reading. And this is, again, comparing males and females that perform exactly the same across each of those two subjects. Finally, I show that beliefs correlate with investments and with child self-confidence. This is just a correlational relationship. And again, here I kind of draw on the body of work that shows that there is a causal link between beliefs and investments. Yes, Will.
Finish what you were going to say.
Okay, and then finally, I'll discuss and explore a couple of these mechanisms that could explain this link. But again, to the discussion earlier with Josh, that's sort of an area for making more progress.
I'm sure you're going to tell us how you operationalize it, but just conceptually, you've been using the word achievement, and then you just use the word performance, and then there's a related concept of aptitude.
Mm-hmm.
How are we supposed to be thinking about what you're trying to get
Yes,
at?
thank you. That's a great question. So when I say performance, so I probably do switch back and forth, and I need to be better about that. When I say performance, I mean the way that a child performs on a test on the day of the survey. So this is like their demonstrated test results. I take that as a measure of their, academic achievement. And then separately, or I guess of their actual performance. Separately, there's beliefs about achievement. So that's the question, how do you think your child is performing? Aptitude itself, I mean, I've tried to steer away from thinking about this in terms of ability, because I think that, if you're looking at children who are 12 years old, say, there's been a lifetime of investments that have been either, coming from a position where your family had a lot of material resources and could get you tutors and send you to the best schools versus not having those resources. So I think I'd be hesitant to say that the performance at age 12, is like a reflection of raw ability. Does that clear up the
Yeah,
distinction?
that's helpful. So you're trying to step away from anything about aptitudes, which is, I think, what drives some beliefs about gender-based differences, right? Perceived aptitudes, but you're trying to just abstract from that and really focus on.
Yeah, but
their
that's
performance.
That's right. But I think that's an important component, is like exactly what you're saying. Stereotypes or beliefs about aptitude influence parental beliefs about achievement in ways that maybe aren't perhaps accurate, right? Based on performance. Are there any other questions before I go on? Okay, so quick roadmap for today. So I'm going to talk about the data. I'll spend a little bit of time on this just because I am pulling from 3 different contexts. So there's a few moving pieces going on. I'll share my main results. This will be the bulk of the talk. So showing just this basic cross-sectional relationship between socioeconomic status and beliefs. I'll spend a little bit of time sharing the causal evidence that links household economic circumstances to beliefs. I'll dip into other results. This looks like a lot. I think it's 2 slides. Could be more depending on how many buttons people want to see. And then I'll discuss very briefly some of the potential mechanisms that I think could explain this. And I do also have evidence on this. A lot of it is suggestive. Okay, so the data is coming from 3 different contexts. So I'm using 3 existing surveys, one of which had a component added on expressly for the purpose of this research. And these questions were designed in coordination with the KLPS team to kind of to work well in that setting. So the first is the India Human Development Survey. So this is a nationally representative survey covering urban and rural areas throughout India. There's over 40,000 households in 2 different waves spanning 2004 to 2012. There's an upcoming or maybe even ongoing wave, and I'm hopeful that these questions will be in there too, but we'll see. So up to 2 children between ages 8 and 11 per household were included in this sample. And that leaves me with a sample of over 20,000 children. One thing to note is I don't observe the same children in both waves. The same households might appear in both waves, but kids age out of this window in between the waves. The second data set that I'm using is the Kenya Life Panel Survey, which is an excellent resource. It's an over 20-year panel data set covering over 7,000 respondents across 4 rounds, starting when they were aged 12-ish. So now that these individuals are in their 30s and the next generation has been born and is growing up, there's kind of a component of that research that looks at the impacts of that look kind of at outcomes across generations. A lot of the folks in the room are intimately familiar with this survey. So the data that I use today is for this research comes from wave 2, so a random half of the sample in the 4th round of data collection, and this took place during 2021. So I'm not using necessarily the panel aspect aside from some elements that have to do with parents. But when I look at kids, they're kids of the original sample surveyed, tested in 2021. These are kids between age 3 and 8, and I have a sample of about 2,400 children. And then the third data set that I'm using is the Early Childhood Longitudinal Study in the US. So this is a long-run data set that covers a sample of children who started kindergarten in 1998 all the way through 8th grade. There was substantial attrition starting in the 5th grade, and so I just use observations from kindergarten, 1st, and 3rd grade. This leaves me with over 40,000 child by grade observations. Okay, so what's unique and what's common about these data sets? So all 3 of these data sets feature 3 components which are crucial for the analysis. So the first are measures of actual test performance in math and reading. The second are stated or elicited parental beliefs about academic achievement. I'll talk more on the next slide about both of these because they're so important. And then the third are measures of socioeconomic status. So household consumption in India and Kenya, household income in the US, and then parental education, caste, or racial group. There's a couple other features that I make use of. So in all 3 contexts, there's pretty extensive measures of parental investments or the home environment or parental engagement. In Kenya and the US, I also have psychological outcomes for parents. In the US, that's just depression. In Kenya, it's a lot of different measures, self-efficacy, depression, aspirations, things like that. And then in the US, I have measures of subject-specific child self-confidence. So in the 3rd grade, these kids filled out this really cute questionnaire that asked them how they feel about their abilities in different domains.
One quick question on socioeconomic status. What should we have in mind for income inequality within these 3 different contexts? And do we need to be worried about things like other forms of asset making up part of your socioeconomic status? So like not just consumption, but also like ownership of other assets that could contribute to, like I own a horse or something, right? Like something like that wouldn't necessarily be reflected in consumption, but would still contribute to.
Yeah, that's a great idea. So I've done robust. So in the Indian and Kenyan context, I also look at earnings, which I guess is very similar to consumption in principle. I should do what you suggested, which is look at wealth or assets. One thing I do in my robustness is just use like designated poverty line status, which is based on at least in India, it's based on your district. And then I do that also in the US, which is based on, household composition and location and things like that. But I have not done robustness to other measures of assets and wealth, but I can do so.
And then how should we think about inequality? So like, yeah, I can be more specific about that, but.
Yeah,
Yeah.
within country inequality. Yeah. I mean, it's an important component here, and all three contexts feature inequality. I mean, I think it's an important component because I think in all three contexts there is, there is a gradient, there's a socioeconomic gradient within the country that people are aware of. I'm not sure if that answers your question satisfactorily.
I think more like what I'm wondering is, insofar there's like sort of like relative differences between socioeconomic status that people are maybe like perceiving with when they're making these like judgments sort of about investments. Like basically, depending on how sort of the data are being stratified, like a low SES person might not be so different than like a medium SES person, who might not be so different than a high SES person, or depending if it's like a super unequal sort of setting,
Yeah.
that difference actually might be quite distinct.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So I guess what you're saying is like if there is a steeper grade, that could inform how I compare across contexts. The main focus is that gradient within context that I'm kind of looking at, and I think we'll see as we go along that there is. I mean, I would argue that there's sufficient variation along within context. Okay, so more on parental beliefs and performance, because these are important components here. So there's measures in all three contexts. There's measures collected as part of the survey, collecting actual performance in math and reading. And so I use as a primary measure just a normalized composite score. So I take their math and their reading score, add those together, and then normalize with respect to other children of the same age or the same grade. I also look at an alternate measure, and this is just within India and the USA. So I can see how well did you perform compared to peers close by you. So other kids in the same village or other kids in the same school. So this I think is a useful measure because it's, it might be that the people that your parent has in mind when they're being asked, do you think your child is above average? They think compared to who? Compared to these people, these local peers. In terms of primary beliefs or parental beliefs, the primary measure comes from answers to the following questions that you see up here. So very, very vague question, but just is or was your child an average student, better than average, or below average? The same question appears in India and in Kenya. And then in the US, the analogous question asks whether parents think that their child learns, thinks, and solves problems as well as other children their age. I use this as the primary measure. So I convert this to whether the parent believes their child is above average, average, or below average. I do have some additional measures in each of these contexts. So in Kenya, we added in questions about future achievement. So how do you think your kid will compare in 5 or so years when they take this high stakes primary school exit exam? In Kenya and in the US, we also have subject specific beliefs. So not just this overall question about your child academically in general, but specifically in math or specifically in reading. And then in Kenya, we did a very careful measurement of parental beliefs, varying that reference group, whether it was kids in the same neighborhood, kids of the same financial status in the same neighborhood, kids throughout all of Kenya. This is useful because we have this overall question as well as all these different questions. It doesn't really seem to matter too much. So that's encouraging. Parental beliefs don't seem to shift very much when you change that reference group, and no household characteristics predict those cases where people do shift. So that's just encouraging as far as maybe this question is okay. It does pretty well compared to a question that's extremely precise,
In the context of the survey, why do parents think they're answering these questions? What's being told to them?
What's being told to them? In the US, actually in all three contexts, they're being asked a lot of questions about their child. So they know their child's being tested. They're being asked a bunch of questions about how much they invest in their children. So I don't know if that's a good question. If they have something in mind specific about this question, or it's just another on a list of 20 that they're answering. I think that at least in Kenya, I think we just say, we need to think about your child. We want to know a little bit more about them. Some kind of intro text like that. But that's a great question. Is there something specific you have in mind that would?
Well, I guess one thing would be if there's variation in the survey, if you can see what the surrounding questions are, and that would be very interesting for how what's going on in people's heads.
Yeah.
But also, when I answer surveys, I'm wondering why are they answering this question that influences my answer. But I think your answer of they're answering 20 things, they're trying to get through the battery is probably pretty true. They may not be thinking a lot about it. They may be just giving a pretty instant kind of response, but I don't know the context.
Yes.
Yeah, so this relates to Will's question. So the question for the Americans is close to an aptitude question. And in the first version, I can imagine the respondents saying, well, my child behaves in school, is a good student, that is good as a student. While the American question could be, well, I know my kid is a troublemaker in school, but he's really, really smart. And so those are not, it seems to me those are somewhat different questions, depending, of course, on the local interpretation.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And so are you, so I think that's a good point. So you're saying this one could be more like, does your kid behave? Are they
Does their homework, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
And the other one could be, you could imagine some proportion who aren't thinking of the school performance, but have reason to believe that their kid is better than their grades or worse than their grades.
Yeah, potentially. So I think one thing that helps with that is that, so in India, this is the only question we have, but in Kenya, they're also asked a bunch of questions that ask, do you think your kid performs well in math compared to others in their class? It's like very specific that it's about their academic performance, not do they behave during math class? And the fact that there's not dramatic differences in how parents respond, I think helps. In the US, I didn't type it out here, but the subject-specific beliefs question is also a little bit different. It's closer to the Kenya one, which is how do you think your child is doing in math this year compared to others in their class? So I probably should include that because I think I think that helps as well, that they're being asked really about academics, not about their overall student, whether they sit quietly in class or whatever it is. Yes.
So just go on measurement. The entire analysis is on beliefs conditional on performance. Yes.
Correct.
Right.
Yes.
And so, we know a lot about how SES influences people's ability to take exams like number one. So I think what you're going to end up with is actually potentially underestimates.
Yeah. Of the
SES gap of beliefs conditional on performance.
Yeah, I agree. So I think that's true. So I think you can decide, but maybe when I show the gaps, it's even more striking if you think that the higher socioeconomic kids maybe came to school with a full stomach and a good night's sleep and were ready to perform well or whatever. So this could be a lower bound on that. Okay.
We have about 15 more minutes.
Okay, so does anybody have other questions? Okay, so let me go into the main patterns. So I'll start with the Indian context. So here I'm just showing the cross-sectional link between socioeconomic status and beliefs. So what I'm showing here is the likelihood that your parents believe you're above average, depending on your relative score. So this is, how far above your village mean, the village mean score of other kids of the same age. Separately for high consumption versus low consumption households, and then separately for non-scheduled tribes and scheduled castes versus scheduled tribes and scheduled castes. So that's like a different form of socioeconomic status that's relevant in the Indian context. So you can see that conditional on the relative score, basically across the whole distribution, high consumption households are much more likely to believe their children are above average. So what I probably should do is draw like a horizontal line here, right? And show that a high income child who scores one standard deviation below their peers, their parents are just as likely to believe they're above average as a low consumption household child who scores one standard deviation above their peers. So pretty stark gaps. The patterns are very similar with respect to caste. Of course, there is a correlation between income and caste, but still we'll see that it goes through when I control for one or the other. So two things to kind of note here are, beliefs are aligned with performance. So there is a positive slope. Parents of all, socioeconomic status kind of increase the likelihood that they believe their child is above average, depending as their score increases, which I think is encouraging. These beliefs don't come from nowhere. There is some link between actual performance and how parents believe. But the main thing really is this gap. This is what I really want to emphasize today. The reverse is true for below average beliefs. So I have, the same picture. We'll see this picture a few times. but the patterns are almost exactly reversed when instead of believing above average, I have believed below average on the y-axis. Okay, very similar patterns in the US. So I do almost the exact same thing, except now this is score relative to others in the same grade and school. But we see very similar gaps emerge. So high income households for all given levels of performance are more likely to believe their kids are above average. And then we also have a white-black gap as well. In Kenya, things are a little bit different. I don't observe this disparity quite as strongly with respect to current beliefs. Without getting too much into the details, one potential explanation for that is that beliefs were elicited following 9 months of COVID-related school closures. So all parents might have been uncertain. All parents might have felt like, I don't know where my kid stands. I'm concerned about their learning. I don't know. So, maybe we can take those current beliefs with a little bit of a grain of salt. There is a little bit of a gap with respect to future beliefs. So this is parents predicting or guessing, how do you think your child will score on this exam that they're going to take in 5 or so years? High consumption household parents predict a higher score than low consumption household parents. So very similar pattern.
The big question I'm thinking throughout this talk is this surprising, or is this what I would expect? So the parents have some information, and then the student takes a test. But the students have other information than about how their students performing. They also have the students' race and class and caste and all of these things. And so the best guess of how their child's going to perform is going to be some mixture of what they know about their child and about their situation. I mean, they're going to use all the information they have to guess at it's not like they saw the child's test score and then replied to you, saw the percentile and then said, is this above average or below average? That's a different thing. What they're doing is they're guessing what you're saying they're doing is kind of guessing at they're predicting their student's score. That's not what the context of the survey is, but that's the way you're thinking of it.
Right.
So it seems like the simplest explanation is kind of like I guess we call the statistical discrimination in different contexts, but they're just taking in information about their attributes and attributing that to their child, and it probably is a completely rational thing to do on average.
I would think the intuitive thing could be the opposite. Parents know about their social circle, kids in their social circle, who are going to be, if they're high income, high performers. And so you would think that would lead them to downgrade their own kids' performance because they don't see the whole universe of kids. They just see the ones in their network. So the naive prediction could go the other way around. And there is some evidence, by the way, in terms of racial differences in the United States of Black families, Black parents overestimating the performance of their kids because their kids, the reference group is so poor, doing so poorly in school that if their kid goes to school every day, they're considered to be an excellent student.
Yeah, and so again, I think you're making an argument that we might expect to see smaller gaps, right?
Or even the
reverse. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, Josh, I see your point, but I think, imagine parents were asked the question, how did your child perform literally on this test? And these gaps still did emerge. Like, that still means that there's a systematically higher income parents are overestimating their kids, if you want to think of it like that. Right, conditional on their actual performance. Why would higher income parents systematically be biased in the positive direction? I'm not sure if that's.
Because they know about their individual child and they know about the advantages that people in their situation typically have, and so they're just right. If I were.
And so you think that those advantages wouldn't show up in test scores? That wouldn't be baked into. Like above and beyond how those advantages, and I agree with you, there definitely would be, and we'll see in the data, like higher socioeconomic status kids perform better, but the gaps are even larger than that. So once you account for performance, maybe the gaps get a little bit smaller, although this is accounted for performance. But those advantages that you speak of, I agree, parents know them, but wouldn't those also be reflected potentially in actual performance? So then once you condition on performance, it's unclear why this gap would remain. Maybe not.
Sorry, I'm having a hard time thinking about what these tests are and what was the situation in which they were taking the test. So you just tell us in the 10-second version what the tests were. And
Yeah.
we know our kids take a lot of tests in school, and a lot of kids will just blow them off and think it's funny to do it wrong or just to not pay attention and just run through really quickly. And
Right.
that could vary by all sorts of attributes, including their parents' expectations, et cetera. So can you tell us a little bit more about the test context, what they were told these are being used for?
Sure. Yeah. Okay. Sure. So they're all three were like a little bit different. So in India, it's an extremely simple test. It's the Osser style test. It just looks at kind of core competency. So can the child recognize letters, words, read a sentence, read a paragraph? Can they add, subtract, and divide numbers? So very, very granular measures. In Kenya, it was actually a very extensive battery of assessments. It took about an hour. Enumerators would sit down with children. I was in the field for some of the piloting. I think that the enumerators and the children took it very seriously. Like they were putting in a lot of, some exceptions, the 3-year-olds would get squirmy, right? But the tests were very carefully designed to measure math and reading. In the US, I think it was more of like a paper pencil kind of like a very standard assessment. So there were a little bit different across contexts. Now, I guess the possibility that kids were blowing them off, that would have
goes
to
the
be.
question before, like it would maybe be a lower bound your effects if the higher socioeconomic status kids took it more seriously on average,
Right.
then you'd have a lower bound argument probably.
Right, they'd be.
I could see going in, lots of different directions. The lower SES kids really want to prove themselves, or who knows?
Yeah.
I have one data question.
Mhm.
Do you have like firstborn, secondborn, like
I
rank?
do, yeah, and I control for that in all the regressions that follow. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so these are great questions. I will pick it up a little bit. So let me just skip through this very quickly, but basically those gaps that I showed you, I put this, so Tara, thank you for the perfect segue. I put this into a regression framework to see, when we control for performance, household characteristics, and child characteristics like age, firstborn status, as well as geography. Do these gaps persist? And they do. When I put this through a regression framework, I see that there's still a positive advantage in terms of believing above average across all three contexts, with household consumption, with parental education, and in the reverse for something like belonging to a disadvantaged scheduled tribe or scheduled caste. Let me skip okay. So another way to look at this is I run basically the same regressions, but I use those relative scores, and then I interact those with whether you're from a low or a high, above median or below median consumption or income household, and then whether you belong to a scheduled tribe, scheduled caste, or identify as Black in the US. And we can see that there are differences. So this is testing for differences in the slope, basically, of the graphs that I showed you before. And we do see that there are differences, right? So in all cases, parents are more likely to believe their children are above average when those children perform better than their peers. That's reassuring, not surprising. But there's an even stronger relationship for the high income folks and a weaker relationship for those belonging to, arguably disadvantaged social groups. Okay, any questions on just kind of the basic pattern, whether you find it convincing or not? Any questions on what I'm trying to argue? Yes.
Was there also a consistency between occupation and whether the parents were encouraged by their kids?
Sorry, say it again. Parent occupation?
Yeah, or in confidence in the kids?
Yeah, good question. That's not something I've looked into. I could do that in all three contexts. Yeah, thank you. It's good. It's a good idea. Any other questions before I move on? Okay, so the next step is to see, okay, so there's this cross-sectional pattern. Is it just a correlation, or could some portion of this represent a causal link between household economic circumstances and parental beliefs? So what I do here is I leverage a natural experiment in India and a randomized intervention in Kenya. Both of these induced exogenous variation in household economic circumstances. So in India, I'm using rainfall shocks And I find that negative rainfall shocks reduce agricultural income among rural households. This kind of makes sense in a context that relies on irrigation for crop production. So whether it's an unusually good or an unusually bad rainfall year can influence your agricultural income. In Kenya, I use a randomized childhood deworming intervention. So this is an intervention which the parents, the ones providing the beliefs, experienced in childhood, which was mass school-based deworming. This program was shown to lead to a variety of really impressive educational improvements, earnings, migration to urban centers, and improved labor market outcomes, even 20 years later. So the goal is to test whether the rainfall shocks and the randomized childhood deworming intervention also influence parental beliefs. So we know they shift household economic circumstances and maybe kind of a bundle of things. Does it also shift parental beliefs? That's kind of the basic approach.
One quick I know I'm like
Yeah.
a room of experts for the Kenya one, but is the amount of cash that's being received by the household, does it vary with the number of kids in the household?
So it's not a cash transfer.
It's just a deworming intervention. Okay.
Exactly. It's an early childhood deworming. So it's the exogenous variation in household economic circumstances is that by virtue of being healthier and going to school longer, they earn more. Yes. Yes.
Also for the deworming, did you say that kids who went through deworming were more likely to move to urban areas or were more likely to?
That's right.
Okay, let's do the results on this and then your mechanisms without discussion, and then we'll have time for discussion at the end.
Yeah, okay, that sounds good. Okay. Okay, so in India, I regressed parental beliefs on the incidence of positive and negative rainfall shocks, and I'm using household fixed effects, year fixed effects, and then some limited child controls. I find, so in the first column, what do we find? I find that a negative rainfall shock, so I'm moving too quickly. A negative rainfall shock is defined as rainfall that's below the 20th percentile in a particular district compared to the historical rainfall for that district. So is this like a really, really bad rainfall year? And then positive rain shock, of course, is above the 80th percentile. So I find that agricultural income declines in the presence of a negative rainfall shock, and beliefs shift in a negative direction as well. So below average beliefs become more likely, above average beliefs become less likely. This is in response to this, transient negative shock. One read on this is you could argue, okay, it's short term. Maybe beliefs suffer for a minute and then they kind of bounce back. Maybe it doesn't impact investments, so it's of no consequence. And that could be the case, but it's still informative that in response to these negative shocks, beliefs actually do shift around. I don't find any impact on performance and investments, and that's important because at least it helps dispel the concern that maybe kids are just actually doing worse in response to a negative rainfall shock. It doesn't seem that that's what's going on. Okay, in Kenya, what happens with childhood deworming? So this result is a replication of published work, but households who have someone who received more years of deworming exposure in childhood, those households consume more later on and are less likely to believe their kids are below average and much more likely to believe their kids will perform better in the future. Okay, any questions on that so far? Okay, so I think I'll skip the other results because I'm pretty much out of time. I can flash this up quickly since we're now familiar with these graphs. So on the left-hand side is believing above average in math. On the right-hand side in reading. The blue line are males and the pink line are females. You can see that compared to equally performing peers of the opposite gender, parents are much more likely to believe males are better at math and females are better at reading. This only appears in the US. I can't test for this in India. It doesn't appear in Kenya. Okay, I'll skip all of the other beliefs, but just very briefly, I find a correlation between parental beliefs and actual investments and between parental beliefs and measures of child self-confidence. And they're stronger when, if your parent thinks you're good at math, you do too, vice versa. I'm also happy to skip the mechanisms, Josh, if it'd be better to.
No,
leave
let's hear
discussion
them.
there. Okay. Okay. Okay, so discussion of potential mechanisms. Again, this is where I think that there's some room for future work, and I welcome ideas, and I'm very happy to get feedback here. kind of bucketing these into three broad groups. The first is the role of material resources. So actually, is there living in poverty or not having access to resources? How does that impact beliefs? So the first idea is that there could be differential access to information. I don't find strong support for that. And that data is coming from both Kenya and the US. There's not a really strong pattern that low-income folks think that they are just in the dark about how their kid's doing. That doesn't seem to be the case. I would also note that that would be an incomplete explanation. So suppose lower socioeconomic status parents did have less access to information. They might be wrong about how their children do. Their beliefs might be less accurate. It wouldn't necessarily explain the bias that I see or the direction. I don't find evidence for perceived disparities in school quality. So in India, lower consumption households and lower caste households are more likely to go to government schools, which are typically of lower quality, but they're no more likely to think that those are lower, they're no more likely to be less confident in government schools. I find some suggestive evidence for complementarity between material resources and investments in Kenya. And what I mean by this is that there is a complementarity between material resources and investments, but parents don't appreciate that. And so they see how their child is performing and attribute all of that to them, just being really, really good at school versus like, okay, they had a tutor and they had all of these different inputs. The next bucket is ways that like associated opportunities could influence parental beliefs. And so I'm not able to test this, but I think that there's reason to believe that inference based on peers and role models and kind of prevailing stereotypes could influence parental beliefs. And so I think this is maybe, Josh, a little bit what you were circling around. And this would be an explanation that potentially could explain all of the patterns, right? Socioeconomic, gender, if stereotypes influence the heuristics that parents rely on, for example. And when they're not sure, they just say, well, I know boys are good at math, so my boy is probably good at math, or whatever it is. This is untested, though. There could be perceived disparities in future opportunities. So maybe parents know how far they're going to be able to have their child go, and somehow that filters back to their current beliefs in some way. Even though they were asked, how does your child perform today? Maybe they're answering the question, how will your child perform throughout their life based on the investments you're able to make.
Josh, this is like your story a little bit, right? That last point?
Yeah,
I think the first one was exactly what I was thinking of. The second one, I guess I would amplify even more that in terms of kind of an advantage to thinking this way, if you're from an advantaged background and you believe that pushing your child harder than that child should be pushed and being over optimistic is a good thing, and it might actually be, then that's why you're going to have that. I mean, you may be picking up a behavior that they've been doing their whole life, and it's just the way people from North Berkeley behave. They all think their kids are going to go to Ivy League schools. They all behave that way.
I see. So that's actually not on here, what you're describing. I mean, it's
Well,
related
it's like
to
the third. It's that it actually, the future opportunities are greater, and they also think that there's a causal effect of their
Right.
beliefs, and so they're going to.
Yeah.
Now, why that would be different between groups is still, I mean,
Still
we can think of
unexplained.
stories, but
Definitely. And then the final bucket is just that beliefs go along with these other things that are impacted by socioeconomic status, such as like hopelessness and depression. We know that there's a higher prevalence of depression, lower self-efficacy, greater rates of hopelessness among low socioeconomic status parents. Maybe belief just slots in right in alongside those in some way. I do find a correlation between these measures and parental beliefs in Kenya. It's a pretty convincing pattern, but it could, it's still not clear exactly, what's going on there. And there's some evidence that higher socioeconomic status parents are like more hopeful about their future prospects compared to low socioeconomic status parents in the Kenyan sample. So there certainly could be something going on here, but it's not, it's still not exactly clear. But yes, Karen.
One question about just the future opportunities, and this is just like thinking about what it could be.
Mhm.
Is there any reason to think that like parents are like looking forward and thinking that like, oh, like the price is going to be too high for my kid to like continue an education, so I should say that the kid is like below average to like, I don't know, absolve myself a bit,
Yeah.
or like right,
All right.
or like if the kid like is doing well in school and the kid's going to move away and then I
Mhm.
won't have like extra help or like whatever, right?
I see. Okay, yeah. So that would be a very behavioral explanation.
Yeah.
Like there's either I'm protecting myself from the fact that it's painful to know I have a really talented child and I can't provide for them, or like I actually want them to stay close to home.
Yeah, it could be behaviorally. I mean, it could also be very much like, you know, my own personal like production function will be higher if the kid stays here, right? Like,
Right.
yeah.
Yeah, no, it certainly could be. Yeah, I think that, yeah, that certainly could be. Okay, so that's essentially it. Just to kind of conclude, I find evidence of this previously unexplored link between socioeconomic status and parental beliefs, and this is common across three fairly different contexts. I provide some support for a causal link between household economic circumstances and parental beliefs using both a natural experiment in India and a randomized intervention in Kenya. Some evidence of subject-specific disparities across genders in the US. And then I show that parental beliefs correlate with educational investments and with child self-confidence. Again, I think some of the existing research that shows this causally is, you know, I would also lean on that a bit. And so kind of just to conclude, these disparities could matter to the extent that they contribute to the persistence of inequality across generations. So thanks everyone for tuning in. I'm very happy to hear any feedback now, or feel free to email me or find me in the hallways or whatever.
Despite intensive discussion during the talk, we're exactly on time. It's 1 o'clock and we have about 10 minutes for discussion. So take it away. Maddie, can you call on people? Or do you want?
Sure.
Okay.
Yep.
I have one question. I noticed there was a slide on this, but how did you measure like actual educational investments?
Yeah.
And yeah, maybe just because like how that sort of aligns with beliefs is very interesting, right?
Yeah, definitely. So it's a little bit different in each context. So in each context, I have about 7 different measures that I draw on for educational investments. In India, this is also like, well, I guess in all 3 contexts, it's just self-reported by the parent. So questions like, you know, how much do you spend on education? Does your child receive any tutoring? Do they attend a private school? Later on, do they go into science or technology track in upper secondary? So there were, you know, different ways of pulling this together across the surveys. I would say in Kenya, we had a primary caregiver survey, which was took about 45 minutes, and it was asking a variety of investments on the like health side, on the time use side, on the educational investment side. And so a lot of these measures come from that. So, you know, how many books are in the home? Are there play materials at home? Does that caregiver play with the child? And then over here, the educational investments ones as well. In the US, this survey was like primarily focused on kids. So while the Indian context is like a general, you know, household survey that interviewed women about their health status and reproductive health, you know, household economic circumstances, and then also tested the children. The one in the US is like really focused exclusively on kids. So here they had a bunch of questions asking, do you ever take the child on an outing? How many days do they do homework? How many
Great.
children's books are in the home?
Ron, can you unmute and ask your question? Ron Pereira?
Oh, yes, thank you. Well, first of all, thank you very much for your interesting information. I'm a retired school teacher from San Francisco and Oakland. And, you know, I was just going to mention and offer to you, I'm sure you probably thought about this, is the education of Black students, particularly in the South, before and after civil rights action and segregation, because many of the older African-American educators from Louisiana in particular, they felt like there was a better education for African-Americans prior to desegregation, because when the African-American students went, you know, to the white teachers didn't believe that they could perform very well. And so Black students begin to not do as well. And so I don't know if that information could be of use to you in your analyzing academic performance at all. But I just thought that in some way that it could be related. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that. That sounds like a distinct project, but closely related. That sounds very interesting. Thanks.
We have previous questions here. Let's do a new questioner here, Vincent.
Thanks, Matt, for the presentation. I want to ask about what you think the role of parental involvement in this relationship is. I mean, I suppose that there is a socioeconomic difference in parental involvement, both within country, but also between countries, right? You know, have higher presence of multi-generational households, I suppose, in India than in the US. So how do you think about parental involvement?
I see. So aside from, that's a great question. I mean, are you thinking of that I could think of that as mattering in two ways. Like, one is having a better sense of how your child does. And so, maybe there's a steeper slope to those lines if parents are more engaged because they just know that how their child performs in math and reading. So I don't know if you mean that way, or as far as as an actual investment, it might matter. If parents are very engaged with their kids, maybe it matters more how they think their kid is doing or something like that. Which way are you thinking of it?
I think the way that how some parents are more involved could have a better perception of their kids' performance,
Yeah.
rather than other parents who outsource some of the parenting to tutors or to grandparents, for instance, and that they don't really have a much broader understanding of child performance that could help them make these decisions or make these beliefs.
Yeah, no, so I would say that's something that is unexplored so far for me in this project. The only thing that the only information that I have is, and this doesn't speak to across countries, but within countries, there don't seem to be stark differences in across the socioeconomic spectrum as far as whether parents believe they receive information from schools or how confident they feel in knowing how their child does. But what I could do is look at if household structure correlates with those measures of confidence. Those are mostly coming from Kenya. We ask parents, how confident are you in your knowledge of how your child's doing? How confident are you in knowing how they compare to others? And I could look at how household structure impacts that. Thank you.
You guys can fight it out. Who wants to go first?
One theme that seems to be in your talk is something that familiar phrase, self-fulfilling prophecy.
Mm-hmm.
That a lot of what you're describing is parents sort of believe their kids are above average and then do things to make that true.
Right.
I just want to refer briefly to this. There's a literature that is probably 25 years old or 50, at least 15 years old that I know of, that has to do with black-white differences, in which the argument is made that a lot of these Black parents have unrealistic expectations of their children because they actually don't have good feedback about what's happening in the classroom, and that you get high levels of aspiration and expectation, which then get disappointed in the schools. So it's somehow the flip side, but that may be a very particular kind of situation. But anyway, if you want to pursue that, I can try to dig up some literature.
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
And last, Will Dow.
Well, thank you. This is fascinating. And I'm particularly interested in the analyses that you're calling the causal analyses of the effects of these sort of shocks.
Mm-hmm.
And I really like how in Kenya, you have this long-term shock. And in India, this very short-term shock. And since you presented to India, well, let me ask about that. I was a little bit surprised, given how you said how elementary the test is, that I think you said that the actual scores didn't vary much as a function of rainfall, which would be consistent with this not being influenced very much by whether you were in school in the last year. It had to do with your sort of cumulative schooling until the last year, but that the parents actually thought that the performance should have varied. And so I'm wondering, again, back to the nature of the question that you're using to ask about performance, could this be interpreted as how did they do in school the last year? Oh, well, they actually didn't get to school a whole lot of times because whatever having to do with this rainfall shock.
Okay, so I may have this. So the kids who were out of school was in the Kenyan sample because of COVID. So in Kenya, the measurement took place after many of the kids have been out of school for 9 months. But so in India, they had been in school prior to when they were asked about this. But so maybe a better response to your question is, in India, the test was really assessing core competencies. And so I think you could argue that maybe it's not surprising that their performance didn't decline because they didn't forget how to recognize letters or forget how to read words. Whereas maybe a more sensitive test like the one in Kenya would have picked up on some loss of learning if, for whatever reason, kids weren't in school. Do you have a follow-up?
Well, it's just that, what was the effect of the rainfall shock? Did that keep kids out of school for some time? Not the
Yeah.
COVID, but if the shock somehow kept kids out of school, so the parents are saying, oh, my kid isn't doing as well
Yeah.
in school now, which is a very different mechanism than some of the other things
Right.
we've been
So
talking
it's-
about.
Yeah, thank you. It's actually been a while since I've looked into that. I mean, so the latest version, I just look at performance and then investments, and I show that neither of those move in the presence of a rainfall shock. Early on, I did look at whether school attendance shifted or whether children were more likely to be working, like on the family farm or otherwise. I didn't find effects. It has been a while since I've looked at that though, so I should probably rerun that. But based on, 6 months ago or whatever it was, like an earlier iteration of this work, they weren't working more on the farm or in a household business, and they weren't attending school less in the presence of a negative rainfall shock.
Hey, thank you so much, Maddie.
Yeah, that's very cool.